So could your army benefit from the help of the chapter librarians in 9th edition? Let's talk about what these crafty blue psychers can bring to the table. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics for another Space Marine strategy video, where today we're talking over Librarians, psychic powers, and what they can bring to a Space Marine force. In a recent video when I looked at what sort of HQ choices people are running for Space Marines, Librarians were second on the list, beaten out only by Captains, so it's safe to say that they offer quite a lot of chapters, quite a bit of value. In the video we'll talk about using Librarians in general and their pros and cons, the different types of Librarian that you can field, a quick discussion of the powers from the main codex and then the chapter specific ones, some common relics, warlord traits and buffs that you can put on your Librarian, and then finish up by how I typically use them in game myself. Plenty to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. First up, being part of the psychic phase and all the shenanigans that go on therein, Librarians do operate a bit differently to the other Space Marine characters. They have some serious advantages over their rivals, but it comes at the expense of some significant costs as well. The main thing that they bring to the table are some serious powerful and flexible buffing abilities. Generally some of the most reliable Librarians are the ones that make your units just go to the next level, with some really interesting and powerful mechanics that you just can't get anywhere else in the Space Marine Codex. With 2 casts, you're typically bringing 2 of these abilities to the table per HQ. Access to Smite and Mortal Wounds is really quite handy when you're switching on to damage mode. It means that if the enemy gets too close with an elite unit, your Librarian could fry them in the psychic phase, never mind having to shoot them or in melee. And Smite can be pretty handy for getting out of certain combat scenarios. Say if there's only a weakened enemy unit left, you might be able to smite them to death in the psychic phase, and then free up that unit to shoot and charge in the later phases. They bring a little bit of melee ability to the table, perhaps not quite as much for the points as their captain or lieutenant counterparts, but still a bit. And they also offer you a source of Deny the Witch in your army, and giving yourself the chance to turn off one of your opponent's most powerful psychic abilities can really lead to some big swings in game. The psychic hood's a little bit short range at only 12 inches, but if the enemy happens to be up close and personal, that's another advantage on that front. However, it's certainly not all a bed of roses for them. I'd say the biggest thing that makes me the most worried about using Librarians in game is the fact that their buffs can quite easily just not go off if you happen to roll low, or if your opponent has some fairly reliable Deny the Witch in their army, then they might just stop your most important power at a crucial moment. In particular, Deny the Witch is really quite a bad consideration when we've just seen the release of Grey Knights, Thousand Sons and Sisters of Battle, all of which have access to some pretty hefty Deny the Witch mechanics, and might lead to your Librarian being a bit of a wasted investment compared with putting the points into another character. They're not all that durable either, they don't have any invul save, so are usually quite easy to kill when compared with captains, and they can potentially be unhelpful for secondary objectives, particularly if you do happen to be fighting, say, Grey Knights or Thousand Sons. Abhor the Witch is quite a powerful secondary to take against them, so ruining your opportunity to take that by using a Psyker could cost you a few easy victory points in some matchups. Finally, though it comes up fairly rarely, is Perils of the Warp. It should only happen in around 1 in every 18 casts, but giving your Psyker the chance of either injuring or killing itself is certainly a negative when compared with the other characters that don't tend to blow themselves up. Basically, with those downsides, the powers that you're accessing have to be pretty valuable, and fortunately in a lot of cases they do tend to be. Before we get into the powers though, let's have a quick look through the different types of Librarian that you can field. Unlike some of the other options like Captains and Chaplains, people seem to be a bit more flexible on which Librarians they use, with pretty much every variety seeing some play in game. Each one's come with their own trade-offs and advantages and disadvantages. The standard one just gets you the psychic powers on the board for as cheap as possible. 90 points is your basic issue Librarian, no questions asked, and I'd see the rest as upgrades that you can put above this guy if you need the extra things that they bring. First up, you can take the jump pack on the same datasheet, that's up to 115 points, gives you the 12-inch movement and the option to deep strike if you want to, and although it's really quite a hefty price to swallow, getting those buffs exactly where they need to go is really quite useful, particularly if you're playing with an army that's moving forward quickly towards the enemy. The Primaris Librarian is basically 5 points over the standard issue one for +1 attack and +1 wound and the option of transhuman physiology. A small upgrade, but could be well worth the 5 points if you do land yourself in a situation where he either saves himself on 1 wound left, or he manages to kill 1 more enemy model. I'd see the Phobos Librarian as an upgrade on the Primaris one. He's an extra 5 points again, and he gains the forward deployment option if he wants to set up in the midfield, and takes the camo cloak for a bit of extra durability at range if he's in cover. He is locked to the obscuration discipline as opposed to the Librarius though, which I would see as a disadvantage myself. Still though, if you're swapping that out for the chapter-specific psychic powers, then he's a bit more of an interesting choice. Finally, and priciest, we have the Terminator Librarian. He's 105 points, and compared with the standard one, gets +1 wound, a 2+ armor, and a 5+ invul save, the option to deep strike, and can buy a cheap Stormbolter in for 5 points that can rapid fire all the way out to 24 inches each turn. If you want a Librarian that can take a punch a bit better than some of the rest, then again that extra few points could well be worth it. I think usually for me I'd be most tempted by the standard one, the jump pack one, or the Primaris Librarian personally. Of course, the various different chapters all have their own unique Librarians and Chief Librarians. Ezekiel's absolutely great for the Dark Angels, +1 to cast Interromancy is very nice. Jarl Stormcaller is really quite hardy for the Space Wolves, and also picks up a +1 to cast. For the Blood Angels, Mephiston and the Librarian Dreadnought are both as much combat monsters as they are psychers, and are some really quite interesting dual-purpose HQs there. Deathwatch have a unique Librarian, though I think typically I'd rather take the more generic ones and have the pick of Relics and Warlord traits. Ultramarines have Togurius, who is one of the most reliable casters in the game, and also has that very nice -1 to hit ability that he can help out one Ultramarines unit with per turn. And there's even a couple of Forge World options as well, such as Severin Loth, the Red Scorpions Librarian, who has a 4+ invul, a bit better in close combat, and can hand out rerolls to wound against Psyker units if your opponent has any big threats like that coming at you. I'd say that the vast majority of these could certainly see play. Perhaps my very favourite are Ezekiel and Tigurius, who I think are absolutely excellent value for the Dark Angels and the Ultramarines. Finally, you can choose to upgrade your Librarians to the Chief Librarian for 25 points. Chief Librarians know 1 extra power and can deny once more, but sadly it doesn't give them any innate bonuses to casting. I think that the upgrade can still be useful if you're playing in a chapter with a really powerful discipline, maybe Space Wolves or Dark Angels. Having the extra flexibility for another one of their great powers could well be worth the points. It does also allow you access to a Warlord trait that can cast better, and a 24-inch range Psychic Hood, which could help out with the denying as well. Of course, that's piling yet more investment on your already fairly expensive Librarian though. I have seen a fair few people use the Chief Librarian upgrade in competitive lists, but I'd still say that most people tend to go without, save the points, and just run the Librarian with the 2 powers. So let's start talking about the many psychic powers that Space Marines have access to then. There are the 2 disciplines in the Codex, the Librarius one and the Obscuration one, the Obscuration one being locked to the Phobos Librarian, and I must admit I do prefer the Librarius one of the 2. My favourite spells of the discipline are Veil of Time, allowing you to reroll Advance and Charge and allows you to fight first. I think that one's particularly quite nice in White Scars, who can both advance and charge in the same turn. Might of Heroes is an interesting one, +1 strength, toughness and attack. That can really allow you to put one other character into rage mode. Could be lovely to layer on a Smash Chaplain or Captain, or even just to throw it on a Redemptor Dreadnought, as it works on core choices as well. Null Zone for Warp Charge 7 is a powerful one, but maybe a little bit situational. Warp Charge 7 and it turns off all invul saves within 6 inches, friend and foe. It means putting your Librarian right in harm's way, but sometimes it could allow you to just effortlessly remove one enemy unit that would have taken a massive amount of firepower to bring down otherwise. Finally, Psychic Fortress I think is a really nice defensive buff. Warp Charge 6 and a 6-inch aura of 5+ invul save. It's quite nice on virtually any 3+ save Space Marine such as Intercessors, but maybe really comes into its own on certain vehicles such as Redemptor Dreadnoughts, which are already good in their own right, but this really helps them fox the heaviest anti-tank firepower that's almost certainly going to be coming their way. Quite a nice addition to a Dreadnought shooting castle. Otherwise, Obscuration does have some interesting ones. In general, I think you'd have to go fairly Phobos heavy to really make it work. You can shroud units to make sure they can't be shot unless the enemy's close. You use Temporal Corridor to move Phobos units around. And there's a few helpful debuffs as well. -1 to hit, Mind Raid for the chance to gain a command point, and perhaps the most interesting spell of the discipline, Tenebrous Curse, that both deals out a mortal wound and also slows down the enemy quite considerably. Quite a nice one to throw at an elite melee unit and hopefully keep it out of the fight for a turn. I'd certainly want that one if I was trying to run a Phobos Librarian with Obscuration. Really though, I think in general the true power of Librarians comes from the individual chapter powers, as I think that the strongest ones of these do tend to be far better than even the Librarius discipline. I'd argue that perhaps one of the single strongest psychic disciplines out of any of them might be the Dark Angels. Just the entire discipline seems like a win to me. You can hand out Fight Last with Mind Worm, Aversion gives you -1 to hit and -1 attack, a really nice combination of debuffs. Righteous Repugnance is one of the best melee buffing spells in the game, rerolling all hits and wounds for a unit for some reason, and you can even turn off Obsec or turn off enemy auras. Having Mr. Ezekiel running around with 3 of these and casting on +1 just seems like it brings a lot of value to Dark Angels lists. Otherwise, I think that another 3 of the chapters that really get good value out of Librarians are White Scars. I think their best one is the +2 to advance and charge power. White Scars already have crazy good threat ranges already, why not add an extra 4 inches to any unit advancing and charging? And they can slow a unit and deny overwatch and some other bits and bobs too. Space Wolves can also hand out fights last, they can get into Assault Doctrine turn 2 or turn 1 if they need to, and they can cover their advance as they move up, handing out an aura of light cover that if you spend a couple of command points on, can turn into an aura of -1 to hit as well. Most enemy shooting is going to struggle at least a little bit more if the wolves all have +1 to save and -1 to hit. Finally, for my favourites, Death Watch can grant a 5+ feel no pain, making any one of their kill teams a massive chore to remove, and have a powerful double melee buffing one, giving their unit fighting first and also +1 to hit. That's quite nice in combination with things like Thunder Hammers. For disciplines I consider perhaps a bit more middling, Iron Hands can be great with vehicles, +1 to their saves, +1 to hits, or healing a vehicle for D3 wounds. Salamanders can make one unit extra durable, -1 to hit with Fire Shield and +1 toughness with Drakeskin. Could be nice on some tanky blade guards slogging it down the field, and you could make some interesting, fun fighty Librarians with a Librarian with Burning Hands. I've had people mention a fun combo of that to me where you put that on a Phobos Librarian and soup him up with a fair few things to give him even more attacks so he can hand out quite a lot of mortal wounds when he strikes. Finally, Blood Angels I think have 2 decent combos. They can either go down the buffing route of giving people a 5+ invul and exploding 6s to hit, or they can take Rage Mode Librarian, Lightning Mephiston or the Furioso Librarian and give them Wings of Sanguinius and Quickening, launching them across the board into combat at breakneck speed and hitting a bit harder when they get there. Finally, we come to the chapters, who I think have a slightly weaker psychic phase on the whole. Imperial Fist Geokinesis is just a bit underwhelming. Maybe the best is healing a unit for D3 wounds, though you can just do that for free with an Apothecary, so I don't really think it's that great. Ultramarines, maybe one of the picks is Scryer's Gaze to farm command points each turn. I just wish there was something a bit more interesting to go alongside it. And Raven Guard do have a few more interesting options, teleporting a character or denying Overwatch, though again I just don't really think that they have that many standout options compared with say White Scars or Space Wolves. Finally, Black Templars like to burn Librarians or Psychers in general, though of course they have some very good litanies of the Devout instead, and I'm sure we might see some more of them when their codex drops next month or so. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about buffing Librarians in game, and in particular relics and warlord traits to pick. First up, there is a successor chapter tactic called Knowledge is Power, or taking the Blood Ravens chapter trait, and that allows you to reroll ones both of Deny the Witch and casting psychic powers. It is quite a good psychic casting buff in my opinion, but I just don't really think it's worth giving up half of your successor chapter trait for that, as the traits really buff an entire army, and it really seems like a waste to me to have one half of the trait solely focused on buffing 1 or 2 models. I think I'd rather just go without this and try and reroll psychic tests with command points if I happen to fail. For warlord traits, there's that +1 to cast with Chief Librarian. If you're taking one, then it's certainly not a bad pickup if the psychic phase is going to be pivotal to you. And another powerful warlord trait could just be taking Rites of War for the aura of Obsec, which seems sensible to have somewhere in your Space Marine HQ choice, and a Librarian can often be a good place to put it. For relics, you can take the Tome of Malquador for them to know 1 extra power, though I would bear in mind that they decided to FAQ this, so you now can't take it from a different discipline from the one that your Librarian is drawing powers from now. It definitely makes it a bit less usable, as before you could use it to mix and match different disciplines, say take 1 power out of Librarius and the other 2 from your chapter specific powers. Otherwise for relics, another quite popular one is the Armor Indomitus. It gives you a 2+ save and a 3+ invul save once per game, and also gives you +1 to your wounds characteristic as well. Certainly can be one way of counteracting the fairly weedy durability of Librarians if they're key to your battle plans and you're worried about them getting sniped. Otherwise, there's plenty of options within the chapters for +1 to cast abilities, either via relics or warlord traits. Space Wolves have the Armour of Rust, which can be a good choice for a Librarian. It's nice to have somewhere just for that fight's last ability, and Librarians can get good use out of the durability too. Also, anything else that improves the toughness would be helpful for Librarians, though I think in general the Armor Indomitus beats out most chapter-specific options. Stratagems-wise, I think the most valuable one is usually going to be command point rerolls when you're casting or denying, and doubly so if you're about to suffer perils as well. Often I think that's one of the highest yield ways to use command points, if that power really is important to your battle plan, or if it gives you another chance to stop an enemy power that's going to ruin you. Finally, I think that Librarians do synergize a bit better with transports and reserves. Say if they're being compared with chaplains, if they happen to deep strike or get out of a transport, they can still use their buffs to full ability. Because the chaplain litanies happen in the command phase, it means that those options just aren't quite as interesting for them. So finally, here are a few general thoughts on using Librarians in game. Obviously it definitely depends on exactly what sort of army you're running. A jump librarian hopping forward to support some white scars on the charge is going to play a bit differently to an Ultramarines librarian using Psychic Fortress to protect some Redemptors. In general, I'd be most tempted to only take the one librarian in the army and not more. I feel like usually you get into diminishing returns after you take one. With the first librarian, you'll take the powers that you want on the board the most, plus having that first Deny the Witch on the board is by far the most valuable one to throw at the most important enemy spell. If you take more, then you're going to be picking less optimal powers, and also if you do invest heavily in librarians, if you do run up against an army that's really good at denying, things like Grey Knights perhaps, you might potentially have had quite a lot of your HQ choices countered in one go. I guess maybe the single most attractive reason to run more might be trying to do some psychic secondaries, such as the Victual one to cast within the middle of the board, which I'd say Space Marine armies aren't the worst at doing, as they often have some good hardy units to hold the midfield against all comers. Still though, I think you will be running the risk of some bad matchups there. In general, I think you'll typically be wanting to start librarians on the board rather than deep striking them. It's usually going to be best to have those powers on the go as soon as possible, and as you can advance and cast powers, it means they can usually get where they need to be relatively easily. In the movement phase, if it's a reasonable option, then try and be just outside the range of enemy deny bubbles. No point in exposing yourself to them unless you actually have to. Generally think about advancing unless you're certain that you're going to be charging as well, and make sure that you're going to be in range for the things that you're going to cast your psychic powers on. In the psychic phase, I'd generally try and have a command point handy, and I'd save it for the most important powers, the ones that are going to give your army the most benefit or harm your opponent the most. You could either just think about casting those first and using the CP reroll if you need it, or you could think about casting last and attempt to bait out to Deny the Witch if the enemy only has one. Generally with Psychers, if the buff really isn't going to help your army at all, say in the early turns of the game and you've got a combat buff to cast, typically I'd just advise not bothering to cast whatsoever, purely because you might get a perils and there's no point in exposing yourself to that risk for no reason at all. Finally, as I mentioned before, I'd certainly consider Smite as another interesting way to deal damage, particularly if your own units are locked up, and you might be able to use it to tip the balance in an ongoing combat, or free one of your own units to charge or shoot something else as the psychic phase happens before the shooting phase. Finally, in combat I'd usually play fairly cagey with librarians. Their melee damage is okay, though they just don't really have the stat line to be soloing entire squads by themselves most of the time. Their durability is fairly bad, so I wouldn't go sending them off on their own unless their purpose really has been served, and now the extra little bit of damage is more important than trying to keep them alive for future turns. I think a lot of the time just not engaging in combat and keeping the librarians safe is going to be a sensible way to go, at least in the first turns of the game. So that just about brings us to the end of our summary of librarians for Space Marines in 9th edition. Let me know if you're using them at the moment down in the comments below, which powers are working for you and why, and do you think that we might see less of them now Grey Knights and Thousand Suns have been revamped to dominate the psychic phase once more. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find it down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.